You're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astle's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, we're talking about memory. Let's begin. Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of Bonus Points. We're going to be talking about some theological or spiritual dimensions of memory based on some of the thoughts I've had as I've been reading through a book on the subject. I'll talk about that in a moment. Just looking over my notes, there are a lot of very different things that we could say, which means this episode runs the risk of being a little bit random or disjointed, but I'll try my best to draw some connections or talk about things in an order that makes sense. As always, you are invited and encouraged to subscribe or follow Bonus Points wherever you listen to podcasts and to share a link with somebody who might enjoy it. You can also go to bonuspointspodcast.com for show notes, behind the scenes, and more. Let me start today's episode by telling you about a book I'm reading right now that was recommended by one of the other teachers, and it's called Moonwalking with Einstein. The author, a journalist named Josh Foer, was covering the U.S. Memory Championships. In these sorts of competitions, memory athletes compete in events that require them to memorize random strings of words or numbers, faces and names, decks of cards, all sorts of things. Anyway, in the course of his research and interviews, Josh found that even though these memory athletes can memorize the order of several decks of playing cards within several minutes, their brains are really nothing special. Physiologically, they're about the same as anybody else. Cognitively, these guys are average. They're not geniuses necessarily. In fact, what he found was that their abilities came more from training than natural talent. So, of course, he set out to train to see if he could do the things they could do. I'm somewhere between a third and halfway through the book so far, but it's made me think a lot about the deeper meaning of memory. And as I've been reading, I've been making some connections to the faith that I'd like to share today. The book is not theological or spiritual, but the idea of memory certainly is. And yes, there will be a link to the book in the show notes. I always hesitate to recommend a book before I've finished it, but I've really been enjoying this one so far. Here's how I'd like to lay out this episode. I want to start by talking about the difference between memory and recall, and then really dig into the idea that memory is all about connection. We'll talk about how memory works by building connections, and how memory connects our past with our present, for better or for worse. We'll talk about how memory enables us to connect with each other, and how memory is about connecting experiences. Finally, we'll go one step further and see how the concept of memory is present in the liturgy. First, let's be clear with our terms. There are a number of words that get used a lot, both in everyday life and in theology, but they're not always used in the same way. I think that memory, or to remember, is one of them. Typically, we think of memory or remembering as a purely cognitive exercise. It's when you recall something into your mind from some deeper part of your mind. Psychologists differentiate between semantic memory, which includes facts and concepts, and episodic memory, which is your memory of past events. We tend to think of memory like a video playback or like a big filing cabinet. When we remember something or recall it, that's just like scrolling back to an earlier part of the video or pulling a paper out of the filing cabinet. The problem is, that's not actually how we experience our memory working. Our memories are not linear and chronological, and they aren't neatly organized in folders. Sometimes we forget things or almost remember them, what's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. The reason for that is that memory actually works by building connections and pathways. That's why something can remind us of something else that's seemingly unrelated. That's also why we forget something and then remember it later. We lost the path to the memory and rediscovered it at a later point. When something's on the tip of your tongue, most of the path is intact, but a crucial link is missing. The reason I bring all of this up at the start is because memory is so much more than just recalling information. When we treat memory as though it's just a cognitive process or just about bringing information out of the drawer, we're minimizing something important. After all, we've been using external devices to help us recall things for thousands of years, from books and stone monuments all the way to the million devices we use today. We're always looking for ways to save some of that information outside of our heads. And I'm not saying that's a totally bad thing, by the way. I rely on many of these external drives for information I'd like to recall, like phone numbers or my to-do list. What I'm saying is these tools are just that, tools. They're not replacements for memory, and they certainly don't tell the whole story. While we're on the subject of recall, let's talk about memorization. As an educator, this is something I feel strongly about, and something that other educators also feel strongly about. Back in the day, memorization was a big part of school. You were expected to memorize different formulas word for word and recite them back. In your catechism class way back when, you'd memorize the questions and answers in the Baltimore Catechism. I know that some of you listening may remember that, and if I ask you, why were you made, you'll respond without hesitation, to know, love, and serve the Lord our God in this life and to be happy with Him forever in the next. Now, eventually this sort of rote memorization got kind of a bad rap. Teachers started saying that we should be focusing on higher levels of thinking, like applying concepts and evaluating them. And this is true. Especially as a high school teacher, I want my students thinking on the highest levels possible. I don't just want them to regurgitate facts in my general direction. But education maybe threw the baby out with the bathwater. Many educators fell for the false dichotomy, assuming that any memorization was contrary to higher level thinking. Not only that, they're quick to point out that with smartphones, we don't really need to have anything memorized. Why memorize anything when you can look it up in 3 seconds? I disagree here. I think that there is still a place for memorization, and that that's not mutually exclusive with higher forms of critical thinking. As my students know, I run a both-and classroom. Yes, I'm going to need you to memorize some things. You may even have to memorize some things word for word. But you do this so that you can more effectively use those higher levels of thinking. I mean, think about it. You can't analyze and synthesize concepts unless you know the concepts, and you can't know the concepts without holding some of that information in your head. Even if you have the ability to look something up, if you're constantly stopping to Google stuff, you'll find it much harder to actually accomplish higher levels of thought. As a Dutch poet once wrote, "One book written in the heart's own wax is better than 1,000 in the stacks." A big part of that is because memory is all about connections. On a very literal level, memories are formed by making connections. We said a moment ago how recalling information is all about accessing pathways that connect different memories. Well, that applies to making new memories as well. When your brain is recording new memories, a process called encoding, it does so by making associations with memories that are already there. This is why mnemonics and other memory tricks work. They connect new information to old information like songs. There's also a trick called chunking, where you make new information easier to digest by connecting multiple pieces of information into one. If I gave you a string of 10 digits to memorize, you might find it pretty tricky. But if I broke it down into a set of 3 numbers, another set of 3, and a set of 4, you'd find that it's a lot easier. By the way, that's exactly why phone numbers are divided like that. I think there's also a spiritual lesson here. Whether we like it or not, we were not born in a vacuum. You did not pop into existence as a self-sufficient grown-up. From the moment you're born, you are part of a vast web of connections. Without these connections, you literally could not survive. Not only that, but you enter stage left with the play already going on. You stepped into a story that has been going on for generations as an heir to that story. And this applies both to our natural families and to the church. In both of these families, you come onto the scene as part of something bigger than you, connected to the millions who came before you. Sometimes, I think we like to emphasize our independence, especially since most of us listening are Americans. We idolize the self-made man who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, Not only that, but we all like a fresh start and a clean slate. How often, especially around New Year's, do we like to talk about the new me? And that's not bad in itself, don't get me wrong. We should always be working on our faults and growing in virtue, but too often we think of this new me as a definitive break with the past. And that brings me to my next point. For better or for worse, our past influences our present. This is how learning works, right? Some experience in your past, whether it was a literal lesson at school or a hard-earned life lesson, it carries its impact forward. And sometimes we do this consciously as people, right? We build monuments, we write history books, precisely so that our present and future can be shaped by the past. This doesn't mean that we're living in the past, just that we recognize the continuity. We're not living in a disconnected series of present moments, but there's a thread that runs through them. This is what enables us to grow spiritually, by the way. The human virtues are things that we have to practice. They're habits that build up over time. It's the same with prayer. As we develop a prayer routine that works for us, we're informed by all the things we've tried before, and what we connect with and what we don't. Now, at this point, it would be good to talk about what happens when memory influences our present in a way that's less than ideal. And I want to acknowledge right off the bat that this can be very sensitive, especially if your memory includes different forms of trauma. I know that some of you listening, many of you listening, have experienced brokenness. And I don't have to tell you all the ways that this affects you in the present. Very often, the hurt and the pain we've experienced in the past just refuses to stay in the past. I think we've all experienced this to some degree. Maybe we hear a song that reminds us of somebody, not in a good way. I don't know about you, but there are good songs that I've had to totally remove from my playlists because of the associations I have with them. And we also experience this on a more general level, right? We're lied to, and then we find it harder to trust others. Even people who have never lied to us, we start to put up those walls and we put on those masks. And sometimes we do that with God as well. We take the hurts that have been inflicted on us by others, and we project them onto God, and we start to lose sight of His goodness and His love. The classic example is how we tend to relate to our Heavenly Father the way we relate to our earthly father. Now, that can be good, right? All of our earthly fathers have flaws, but some of us are blessed to have just fantastic fathers, and I put myself in that group. My dad's awesome. But if maybe our father's flaws are more obvious, that can make it harder for us to speak with God as a father. No matter what your story is, we often find ourselves in this position where our memories need healing. So what do you do with that? Well, the first thing we should do, is bring that into prayer and invite the Lord to heal our memories. This is what we do with our wounds, right? We show them to the Lord. Before the doctor can treat you, you have to let him know what's wrong. So we begin by being honest, right? We have to be honest with ourselves about these hurts and these wounds. So we show the Lord our wounds, especially those that are in our memory, and then we invite Him to heal them. Now, this doesn't happen overnight typically, but just like a chronic treatment for a chronic issue, we keep going back and we keep opening our hearts to the divine physician. Not only is memory a way of connecting with the past, but it also enables us to connect with other people. Think of your best friend. Often our best friends have this long history of good memories that we've made together, and then those memories form and strengthen our connection. Not only that though, without memory, it's impossible to connect with anybody. In this book that I'm reading, I read about a man named Clive Waring. After a virus destroyed part of his brain, he was diagnosed with severe anterograde and retrograde amnesia, which means his brain cannot form new memories or access most old ones. He remembers his childhood, his experience in World War II, and that's about it. Every day he takes a walk around his neighborhood, a neighborhood that is entirely new to him, and meets his neighbors for the first time, at least as far as he's concerned. Even his wife is a new face every single day, and it's heartbreaking because even though there is so much sacrificial love there can be no psychological connection. In his mind, they're always strangers. At the beginning of the episode, we contrasted memory from recall. We said that our memories are much more than just a filing system that can load old files into the system. In a sense, our memory is a way of reliving the past or connecting it to the present. And when we talk about memory in the context of the liturgy, it means even more than that. At the Last Supper, Jesus institutes the Eucharist, right? And he tells the apostles, "Do this in memory of me," or in remembrance of me. And when Jesus uses that term memory, he's talking about something much bigger than recall. The Greek word here for memory is anamnesis. Anamnesis isn't just about recalling a past event, but bringing it into the present. When we talk about the Eucharist, we use the word representation. We believe that every Mass represents the events of the Paschal Mystery. For Catholics, the Mass is not just a reenactment of the Last Supper or the cognitive exercise of recalling what happened. For us, the Mass actually forms a connection between what is happening on the altar, what happened in the upper room, and what happened on the cross. Jesus told his followers in John 6, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you." The same Jesus gives us a way to do that when he says, "Do this in memory of me." There's an old spiritual that my church would sing every year during Lent growing up, and it's called "Were You There?" We can say in a very real way, yes, we are at every Mass. This idea of representation did not originate with the apostles, though. Actually, the ancient rabbis used very similar terminology to refer to both the binding of Isaac and the Passover. Let's talk about Passover first. When the Lord freed the Israelites from Egypt, he struck the firstborn of the Egyptians as the 10th plague. Before that happened, he instructed the Israelites to perform a sacrificial meal so that the angel of death would pass over their houses. This Passover sacrifice wasn't just a one-time thing, though. They were instructed to keep the Passover as an annual memorial. Now, the way the ancient rabbis understood it, the yearly Passover sacrifice was not merely a repetition of what happened in Exodus. It was a way for Jews of every generation to participate in the first Passover. We read about this pretty explicitly in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is an ancient collection of rabbinic teachings and traditions that was compiled over hundreds of years and written down around 200 AD. Sometimes it's called the Oral Torah. When it talks about the Passover, it says, "In every generation, a man must regard himself as if he came forth out of Egypt. He brought us out from bondage to freedom." They had a similar idea about the relationship between the binding of Isaac and the temple. This one could be a whole thing, but I'll try to just hit the main points. So, in Genesis, we have Abraham being told to sacrifice his son Isaac. As my students know, there's a whole lot we could say about that story, but a key point here is that Isaac's sacrifice was voluntary. He was not bound against his will, but freely offered himself, knowing what was about to happen. I mean, he asks Abraham, "Hey, we have the fire, we have the wood, but what about the lamb?" And Abraham replies, "God himself will provide the lamb," which is kind of a cryptic answer. Isaac's probably starting to figure it out. But then we have this moment where Abraham binds Isaac. Now, we know that Abraham was old by this point, and we know that Isaac was young, right? Most traditions say that Isaac was around 30 to 33 years old. We know that he was at least strong enough to carry all that wood up the mountain. So I know sometimes artists depict this as with Isaac being like a young child. No, he was full grown. He was a man, and his dad was old. It would have been impossible for Abraham to bind Isaac against his will, just from a physical standpoint. So the fact that Isaac is bound on the wood indicates a level of willingness on his part, that this was a voluntary sacrifice. For that for the ancient rabbis was key, right? That willingness was what made the sacrifice so pleasing to God. Now, skip ahead a few hundred years. Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, but he doesn't just put it anywhere. He puts it on the same mountain that Abraham and Isaac had climbed, Mount Moriah, which was known as Mount Zion by the time of Solomon. All day long in the temple, you have the priests sacrificing different animals to forgive sins. Why would those sacrifices forgive sins? Well, if you asked those ancient scholars, they would say that it was precisely because the temple was built on the same spot as the binding of Isaac. They said that the temple sacrifices were a representation of Isaac's voluntary sacrifice that was so pleasing to God. All of this is true of the Mass, but in an even deeper way, because Christ becomes truly present under the appearance of bread and wine. I'll close here with the Catechism, because the Catechism sums this up very nicely. The Eucharist is the memorial of Christ's Passover, the making present and the sacramental offering of his unique sacrifice in the liturgy of the Church, which is his body. In all the Eucharistic prayers, we find, after the words of institution, a prayer called the anamnesis, or memorial. In the sense of sacred scripture, the memorial is not merely the recollection of past events, but the proclamation of the mighty works wrought by God for men. In the liturgical celebration of these events, they become, in a certain way, present and real. This is how Israel understands its liberation from Egypt. Every time Passover is celebrated, the Exodus events are made present to the memory of believers, so that they may conform their lives to them. In the New Testament, the memorial takes on new meaning. When the Church celebrates the Eucharist, she commemorates Christ's Passover, and it is made present. The sacrifice Christ offered once for all on the cross remains ever present. As often as the sacrifice of the cross by which Christ our Pasch has been sacrificed is celebrated on the altar, the work of our redemption is carried out. That's going to do it for today's episode. I hope it wasn't too all over the place and that you found something of value here. If nothing else, I hope it gave you some food for thought. Like I said at the top of the show, I'm not done reading Moonwalking with Einstein, so I can't recommend it for sure, but I am really enjoying it so far. So how about this? I'll recommend it, but if I finish reading it and that changes, I'll update you in a future episode. But so far, it's really good. It actually has referenced St. Thomas Aquinas a few times because he wrote about memory. And so after I'm done with this book, I might have to dive into what the angelic doctor had to say. For now, I have a few resources to offer you. I'll have a link to Moonwalking with Einstein so that you can check it out for yourself. I'll also link to the book Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist by Dr. Brant Petra, which has a chapter on the Passover and how it was represented every year. I'll link to the Mishnah and an article on the Catholic thing that provided some good ideas to bring in. Finally, I'll link to the paragraphs of the Catechism that I just quoted here. As always, you can find these resources in the show notes on bonuspointspodcast.com. There you can also find links to where you can find this show on all sorts of different platforms, so you can just send a link to somebody no matter where they listen to podcasts. And if you know of a particular platform that doesn't currently carry bonus points, but you'd like to see it there, let me know. I'm always looking for ways to make this show as accessible as possible. Until next time, I'm Mr. Astle. Thank you for joining us once again as we continue every episode to put out into the deep to explore the world of theology and beyond.